In the last lecture, we were talking about the emergence of a capitalist commonwealth. And I had told you that one of the things that you saw was the industrialization of the American society. And this had good things, and it also had bad things when it comes to affecting American freedom and equality. We're going to continue on in our discussion of that theme, economic development, and what's happening in the American economy in this lecture. Now, we left off, or at least toward the end of the last lecture, we were talking about how industrialization is one thing, but you need a mechanism to be able to deliver those goods and keep goods coming in that are essential to produce finished manufactured goods, and that would be transportation. Now, like any other time period in really human history, things get better as they unfold. Certainly transportation would be one of those things. If you think about it, one of the things that I often like to think about is the idea of an airport. Maybe this is just me and my simpleton kind of mind, but I find it absolutely fascinating that you could go to an airport like DFW and you can get on a plane, and within hours you can be virtually anywhere in the world. Back even as late as the 1880s or 1890s, there were very few people that really traveled outside of their state, in some cases outside of their county. And it was simply because we didn't have the kind of transportation infrastructure that we do in the 21st century. And it's continuing to get even better and better if you count in things like the communication revolution that made the idea of communicating in various forms and fashions easier and cheaper at the same time. That's the exact same thing that happens in the early to mid 19th century when it comes to the transportation revolution. Okay? As we begin to move westward, both in the northwest and also in the southwest, we begin to develop new technologies that are making that process easier. So for those of you following along with me in your PowerPoints, I'm on a slide called The Transportation Revolution Forges Regional Ties. There's a graph on that slide, or an image anyway. I want you to take a look at that image. It's got pictures on it, a horse and buggy, a railroad, a steamboat, and then another boat. But on the left-hand side of the image is the year 1800, and then a column indicating the prices per tonnage. And then on the right-hand side would be 1850. So I want to start out at the top with the horse and wagon. In 1800, it would cost you 30 cents for every mile per ton that you needed to transport. Okay. What happens to it? Well, in 1850, it goes down to 15 cents. Why? Did we get stronger, faster, better horses? Probably not. Did we shrink the size of the United States? Definitely not. We're getting bigger, if anything. No, the reason that price is coming down is you had various other forms of transportation in 1850 that were simply not invented before that time period. You had the steamboat, which was not invented in 1800, but by 1850 it was charging half a penny, half of 1 cent, to move a ton of whatever commodity that you're talking about from point A to point B, per mile, of course. Now, why is it that water travel, and in particular steamboat travel, is so cheap compared to something like the railroad? Well, in a lot of ways, those two questions are kind of connected in the sense that, one, like the steamboat, the railroad was not around in 1800. It begins to go more and more mainstream as we approach the 1850s. And number two, because most people traveled via water before 1850, steamboats had got an earlier start than railroads. And as you can imagine, one of the things that you need to have a railroad would be railroad tracks. And these things not only took a lot of time to build, but they also were quite expensive to build. And so when we get everything set up and paid for, the railroad is going to pay massive dividends. It's going to be much more convenient considering you don't need water and you can go over the top of water on a railroad. Not the case in a steamboat. But by 1850, it's still not at the point where it's paying for itself quite yet. And so therefore, one of the things that the people in the steamboat industry realize is if they're going to stay competitive, if they're going to convince Americans that need to do business elsewhere and travel or ship something, they're going to need to give them a reason to go with the steamboat company as opposed to the railroad. And in this case, that something would be a monetary incentive, right? As you get more and more railroad networks that are connecting all of these major lines and later on all of these major railroad regions, the steamboat companies, in order to stay competitive, are going to have to lower their prices. And again, it's got nothing to do with they're faster or they're just better at moving around. It's got everything to do with enticing people to purchase their product. And in this case, one of the things that they have to do because of the convenience of railroad travel is charge less. Okay. So anyway, as I'd mentioned before, this transportation revolution has unintended consequences, including populating the western part of what was then the United States. In the South, I'm talking about places like Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas. In the North, I'm talking about Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Iowa. People, in addition to goods, products are being moved from the east to the west. Speaking of steamboats, there's a name that I'd like you to associate with the steamboats, and that would be Robert Fulton. Okay, Fulton was a really instrumental engineer, especially when it comes to the steamboat industry. And the way that I always like to think about Fulton is that he really perfected the steamboat itself. One of the things that he did was made the steamboats more durable. And by durable, what I really mean is they were able to go places that they weren't able to go, shallower waters, for instance. After Fulton kind of made innovations to perfect them versus the kind of boats that were being used before. Right? The kind of boats that were being used before had these big, deep hulls, and in the case of shallow waters, as you can imagine, they got stuck. And so what Fulton did is he kind of flattened out the hulls, and that allowed you to continue to pack, products, pack material onto the ship and move it. But at the same time, you didn't have to worry about the ship running aground because its hull wasn't quite as deep. Okay, but this transportation revolution and the steamboats, generally speaking, gave rise to a new controversy in American life. What happens if one entity doesn't want to compete with a rival company, right? What happens if Nike has been dominating a region for decades and decades, and all of a sudden it has to compete with Adidas? Probably doesn't want that. There are things that Nike could do to influence the market and keep Adidas out of various markets. But what we've got in this day and age, the 21st century, are federal laws that enforce fair market practices. The idea of enforcing fair market practices goes all the way back to a Supreme Court case in 1824 entitled Gibbons versus Ogden. Okay? In this case, what the Supreme Court did was it ruled that only Congress would have the right to regulate interstate travel. And furthermore, no entity, be it local, states, federal, private, or otherwise, would have the ability to completely monopolize a market, do things to restrict the flow of goods from one state to another for selfish purposes. In other words, what Gibbons versus Ogden is doing, it's not only giving Congress the right to regulate interstate commerce, it's also more or less enforcing a free and, more importantly, fair marketplace. If people in New Jersey can produce something just simply better and for less money than people in New York, that company in New Jersey ought to have the right to sell to people in New York. And more importantly, the people in New York ought to have the right to buy that cheaper, better quality product. So Gibbons versus Ogden really puts an end to this transportation monopolies that various industries and interests were trying to use, try to restrict the market for their own selfish purposes. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about railroads, because as we get further and further into the 19th century, it's going to be railroads that are going to replace water transportation when it comes to the preferred mode of transportation in American economic life. The railroad hub, the railroad capital of the United States, to some extent it still is, that would be Chicago. Okay. It might be difficult for you to imagine this, picturing Chicago and its lay of the land right now, but Chicago is once upon a time called the gateway to the West. And the reason being is it was probably the easternmost point that still had contact with farmers in Iowa and Minnesota, farmers as far west and south as Arkansas, later on Texas. And so when railroad lines were built, most of, if not all, led into Chicago. All these major railroad arteries would lead right in there into Chicago. And so what you would have is corn and wheat and pork and other products, cotton, that would be imported from the quote-unquote West, and then it would be redistributed, put on new railroad lines, and shipped over to the East to places like Boston, places like New York, places like Philadelphia, places that would go ahead and process them into finished products. Okay. Now, what this does is it really makes cities, Chicago in particular, it really makes cities important places in terms of the American economy. Okay. You've got all this commerce, all this stuff that's going into places like Chicago. You could probably make the same case for a place like New York also, redistribution centers. But anyway, if you are a producer, somebody like John Deere, who was a blacksmith that would later on make agricultural products, plows and things of that sort, it makes a lot of sense to set up your shop in a place like Chicago, considering all the farmers are familiar with it. From time to time, they actually go into Chicago, so you get a really captive audience in a place like Chicago. The other thing that you need to be mindful of is cities. Those are places that are beginning to grow rapidly when it comes to their populations. Okay, we're a little bit premature to begin talking about this, because one of the things that you're going to see, especially beginning in the 1840s and really getting going in the 1850s, German immigration, and to a larger extent Irish immigration. A lot of these people coming over from Europe, they're setting up themselves, their families in these urban centers: Boston, Chicago, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia. And so if you're John Deere, not only does it make sense from a marketing standpoint to locate your business in Chicago, it makes sense from a production, from a manufacturing standpoint, because you've got a lot of people. And what that means is your supply of labor is very, very great. And anytime you have a supply of any kind of commodity, labor included, that's great, it's going to mean that the price is going to come down. So the bottom line, and I want you to write this down, it's cheaper to produce in urban centers like Chicago. It's cheaper to produce in cities. So what John Deere does is he relocates his business, which was once upon a time centered in the western part of Virginia. He moves it to Chicago for reasons that I've already outlined. It was more marketable there, and it was also cheaper to do business in Chicago. Okay? So what I'm getting at here is you're beginning to talk about a process known as urbanization. Okay? All urbanization really means is the growth and the development of cities. Now, when many of you think about cities, you probably have a very romanticized, glamorous kind of understanding of what it means to live, work, or be in a city. Okay? The simple fact of the matter is, these cities were blowing up, getting huge before anybody with any kind of sense or planning ability could really do anything about it. There's a point in time in the 19th century where virtually every major American city burns, simply because these buildings that would go up, they would go up with no kind of fire code in mind. They would be spaced very, very close together. And not only that, they would all be made out of things like wood, combustible material that when fire would spread from building 1 to building 2, it was virtually impossible to stop that from happening. Okay? Now, it's not just fire hazards, general safety hazards. Cities were dirty. They were overcrowded. There was virtually no sanitation coding in places like Chicago, New York, Boston, like there is nowadays. So you can only imagine what the streets of these cities look like, with all of these people packing themselves in there, and all of these factories and manufacturing firms that are churning out what you and I would call pollution in this day and age. So, like everything else that I've been talking about with respect to industrialization, there's a good side and there's a downside. The good side is when the cities get bigger, they become places of opportunity for both workers. That's where workers went to find jobs. And they also become places of opportunity for producers. It's cheaper to produce there for reasons that I've already outlined. But there is also a downside to this. As the cities continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, clearly it limits American freedom, and it also limits American equality. Think about it from the perspective of the business owner, right? The guy that owns the factory. Do you really think that he's going to live in inner city Chicago, right? Do you think that he's going to live where the hustle and bustle is most intense, where the pollution is the most severe, where the living conditions are the most depressed? Probably not. It's probably going to live somewhere in what you and I would call the suburbs, right? So think about that from the perspective of the working class individual that is almost forced to live in inner city Chicago. If you live in dilapidated housing and you live in constant outbreaks of these really terrible diseases, it's really going to make, quote unquote, making it in American life that much more difficult. So urbanization, in addition to all these other nasty things that we've been talking about, is really going to pose a critical problem when it comes to um, equality in American life. Okay? So what I want to leave you with is the kind of economy that you begin to see emerging in the mid-19th century. In the North, what you see is the emergence of what we call a free labor economy. Now, what a free labor economy means is workers are free to contract their own labor with whomever employer they choose. So in this sense, what the North is saying is there's a freedom that exists in Boston and Chicago and New York that does not exist in the South. Because in the South, what they've got is a chattel slavery economy, or at least it's based on coercive labor, where slaves don't really have the same kind of opportunity, or so they don't have the opportunity to contract their labor the same way that free white workers do in the North. And to a lesser extent, rural, working class, landless whites have much less of an opportunity to prosper and to grow their economic fortunes as people in the North, workers in the North, because they can't compete with the slave owners, with the big plantation owners. And so there's a lot of Northerners that during this time period that are saying they're more small d democratic, they're freer, there's more opportunity in the North because of this free labor economy. If you don't like the way that your employer is treating you and you work for the Acme company, you could always go down to the Beta company and see if you could get a job there. Maybe they pay better there, maybe they treat you better there, maybe there's shorter working hours there. So this is what I'm getting at when it comes to the developing differences between the northern economy and the southern economy. Southern economy is not only primarily based on coercive labor, it's also an agrarian economy and a far less diversified economy. Okay, so you've got the North and the South, and they're increasingly growing further and further apart. But as we get into this whole issue of industrialization, you're going to get people like Harriet Martineau, who I've already mentioned and you've already had to read about, and Seth Luther, another working class activist in the middle 19th century, that are really going to ask the question, what real difference from a perspective of liberties and personal freedoms, I guess to a lesser extent you could say equality, what kind of real differences is there between the southern slave that works on a cotton plantation and the northern operative that's working in a cotton mill, processing that raw cotton into first thread and eventually textile? Both of them have clear limitations that are put on their freedom and their equality, to some extent opportunity. Obviously, this does not take into account things like morality or the fact that workers in the North are not being beaten the same way that slaves in the South are. But people like Seth Luther are beginning to pose the question that one of the things that industrialization is really beginning to do is threaten the idea of freedom and equality in American life. Clearly, the workers that are working inside the factory don't have the same kind of equality when it comes to decisions made in their day-to-day life that people that own the factories do. Now, a very good example of this is something that you've been reading in Sam Patch. There's a point in that book where he's talking about the employers, all the bosses that just got together and made an executive decision to um, push the lunch hour back by 1 hour. It used to be noon, and they decided they were going to push it back to 1 o'clock. Because all the power, just about all the power in that particular dynamic is on the side of the bosses, of the employers, there was a limited amount of ways that workers could resist this whole process. Now, if you've read this far in Sam Patch, you know that workers do resist the process, but I'm hopeful that you can see the dynamic that's beginning to take place. That because the owners of the factories control the means of production, they have an enormous amount of control over how the factory runs. Um, the workers are going to need that job a lot more than the factory owners are going to need the workers, because they'll always be able to find somebody, immigrant or otherwise, that would be very willing to take that job. And so this being the case, because it's always a race to the bottom, what you're going to see are equality that is beginning to be skewed in the favor of the people that are owning the factories and the means of production. And so we're going to leave it right there. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of the other long-term effects of the American Industrial Revolution.